The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to SPEX CertiPrep's webinar on the art and chemistry of wine. I'm Peter Esco, Marketing and Communications Manager here at SPEX CertiPrep, and I will be moderating today. Before we begin, I'd like to get a few housekeeping items out of the way. First off, everyone who registered for the webinar will be sent a copy of the presentation slides. The webinar is being recorded, and we will post it on our YouTube channel so that you may watch it at your convenience. We will upload it there in about a week or so, and you'll receive a follow-up email with the link when it's available. Any questions you may have will be answered at the end during our Q&A session. Just type them into the question box as you think of them, and time permitting, we will answer as many as we can. With that out of the way, let's get on with today's presentation. I would like to introduce Ralph Obenauf and Patricia Atkins. Ralph is the president of SPEX CertiPrep and SPEX Sample Prep. In addition to his PhD in chemistry, he has been an urban vintner for over 10 years now, winning a number of awards. Patty is our product application specialist and has worked on a number of research projects here that you may have already seen, including our toxic metals in pet food and BPA and phthalates in consumer water sources webinar. She presented a poster at PickCon on the presence of trace metals in lipstick, which will be published as a white paper later on this year. Ralph and Patty, I'll pass it off to you.
Thanks, Peter. Well, as Peter said, I've been an urban visitor, as the term is, for about 12, 13 years. I make several barrels per year, each one with a different group of friends. Usually is one with Chilean grapes that they bring up by boat through the Panama Canal, and the other 3 or 4 are with California grapes in the fall. Of course, the Chilean grapes are harvested in our spring. I'd like to encourage anyone who ever has the opportunity to make wine to do it, because it's just a lot of fun. As you see at the steps we go through, everybody's having fun at each stage of the making process, and you learn a lot while you're doing it. And what other thing can you have fun at, learn a lot, and walk away with several cases of wine? I also would like to point out that one of the barrels that I do, we make with the SPEX staff team, and it's a team building exercise. And again, you'll see when you're making it, you're working together as a team. And in this case, it takes place over a period of really 11 months with the different stages of making the wine, and it really makes people pull together. So that.
Well, we're going to start with the chemistry of wine right from the minute that the grapes are grown. And viniculture is the science and study of all aspects of wine grape cultivation and production. So right from the get-go, everything affects the actual aroma and flavor and the quality of the grapes that are harvested for winemaking. You have seasons, weather, minerals, the time that the grapes are harvested, whatever pruning methods are used. This all affects the quality, the aroma, and the flavor of the grape. And harvest time, the harvest is actually determined when the growers look for some benchmarks in levels of things like sugar, acid, and pH. They're looking usually for sugar or a percent Brix level of greater than 15%. And the later they harvest those grapes, the more sugar that there is accumulated in the grapes. They're also checking the acid levels of the grapes, specifically for tartaric acid. And finally, they're looking at the pH of the grapes. Some other factors they might consider, depending on what the varietal is what the tannin development is like in the grapes. And they usually determine this with seed color and taste. Then another decision that might be made at the actual vineyard where the grapes are grown is whether or not they're going to do any treatment to the grapes before they're sent to be made into wine. White wines, they will tend to leave the stems intact to ship them, and red wines, they might actually choose to remove the stems.
Well, that's me with my first barrel of wine that I made on my own. It's good old barrel number 444, and it was a straight Zinfandel, red, of course. Over the years, I've changed my wines that I make, and anymore I make blends. Of course, it can be anything from a Cabernet Shiraz to a Chateauneuf du Pape with 3 or 4 different grapes in it, different varietals, as they're called, and those are considered maritages.
If we look at some of the varieties of grapes, there's over 10,000 varieties of grapes grown in the world. But most of the common species of grapes and almost all the European varieties of grapes used for wine are the Vitis vinifera, and they're actually grown on every continent except for Antarctica. And then the grandfather of or the ancestor of the modern grapevines is the Vitis sylvestris. In looking at where we use the grapes in the world, 71% of grape production is used for wine, and 27% is used for fresh fruit consumption. About 2% of grapes are used as dried fruit. The top regions that actually produce wine in the world are Italy, France, Spain, the U.S., and Argentina.
The one interesting thing that happened about late 1800s, and a parasitic or a small insect was brought over from the New World into the grape stalks in England. It decimated the grape stalks in England in about 10 years or so. It was a root louse that basically destroyed the roots of the grapevine. It spread throughout Europe within another 10 years, and they were losing all the traditional grapes, Cabernets, and grapes that they grew in Europe for many, many years. What they discovered was that there are three, possibly more, but three real good rootstocks in the New World that resisted this small bug, this root louse as it's called. So what they did, and what they still do today, is they plant this American, if you want to call it that, root, and then they graft whatever varietal is required on top of that rootstock. So again, to this day throughout the world, that's what's done. Without it, who knows, we could have lost many, many of our different varietals. So, chemistry of the grape. Grapes are about 70 to 90% water, as you can imagine. The rest is sugar. So obviously, if you have 85% water, you have 15% by weight sugar. That's a lot of sugar in it when you think about it in the juice. Table grapes have about half that sugar content. You taste the grapes while you're making them ready for grape-making wine. They're extremely sweet. And of course, they've been cultured over the years to be very sweet, so you end up with a higher alcohol content than you would otherwise. And then, of course, there's the different kind of tartaric and malic acids, about 1% of that, and amino acids, potassium, and other vitamins and esters, and aromas. That's basically what goes into making grape juice.
Just an interesting bit of trivia. If you've ever wondered how much grapes are needed to make a bottle of wine, 2.5 pounds of grapes are actually needed to create a bottle of wine. If we look at some of the chemistry involved with some of the aroma and flavor compounds of the different varietals, there are lots of classes of compounds that are responsible for all of these flavors and aromas. Here I have listed a few of the more important compounds. You have the methoxypyrazines. They give you the earthy, grassy, bell pepper kind of smells and flavors in wine. And they're very characteristic of things like a Cabernet Sauvignon or Sauvignon Blanc. You have the monoterpenes, things like linalool. They'll give you a floral scent, a floral flavor to an aroma. And something like a Gewürztraminer or a Riesling would be notable for those monoterpenes. And you have the norisoprenoids, things like vanillin, which will give spice, rose oil, and vanilla flavoring. That's like a Chardonnay or Pinot Noir. And then you have your thiols or your mercaptans, which will give you some of your onion and garlic compounds. Those are your stinkier kind of compounds. You'll see those in a wide range of varietals. And then finally you have some glucosides. They'll give you a chocolatey or a tobacco aroma to the wine. And you'll see things like Corks that will have some of those glycosides. We move on now to the actual wine-making process. Oenology is the science and study of all aspects of wine and winemaking. And incidentally, the oldest known winery was discovered in Armenia, and it's over 6,000 years old.
Well, once we've grown the grapes and harvested them and hauled them into the winery, next thing you have to do is crush the grapes. And there's Peter up on top of the bench putting a carton of grapes into the hopper of the crusher. This machine is, I don't know if you can see it at this end, but basically, the grapes go in here, and there's a auger screw that separates the stems. So with red wine, you want to get rid of the stems because you'll end up with too many tannins. But it separates the stems, which fall into the garbage can over here. The grapes themselves go down between a series of rollers that are narrow enough gap in them to crush the grapes completely, but not so narrow as they crush the seeds. And they fall down into this large plastic giant vat, whatever you want to call it. That holds, well, at least 60, probably holds 100 gallons in this vat. And you put enough in, and I use 60-gallon barrels, so we end up filling it about 3/4 full. The comment I have here about natural is not better. Well, any fruit and probably any leaf on any plant has natural native yeasts on it. And I say natural is not better because you tend to get better wine and better flavors in that if you use tried and true vintage yeasts. But if you have the 100 or 200 or maybe 1,000 different yeasts that are naturally occurring on the grapes and on the leaves, they might make mistakes sometime when they're making alcohol, and it might not come out that well. So what we do is, I think on the next slide, we talk about actually we kill the native yeasts with potassium or sodium metabisulfite, and then wait a day, and the sulfite comes off the must, as it's called, and then you spike it with true vintage yeast. So you have a homogeneous fermentation going on in the vat, and in spiking it, it ferments faster.
It depends also when you're crushing the grapes, depending on the variety and method of wine you're making. In some varietals of wine, or some white wines or rosés, you're going to prepare your grapes a little differently than if you're going to make red wine. So for white wines, they tend to leave the stems intact. They do this to increase some of the tannins in the wine. They also want to reduce the exposure of the color of the grapes in the skins to the wine. So if you have a red skin grape and you're making white wine from it, by taking those stems and keeping them with it, you limit the contact of the skins with the wine. And the skins they try to directly actually remove from the wine so you don't get any color from the skin of the grape. For rosés, you could use red skin grapes with some minimal contact with the skins, or you could use a blend of white and red grapes. And then for red wines, they'll usually remove those stems immediately. They want to encourage the contact of the skin with the must, but they want to take those stems out because they don't want to increase the tannins in the wine.
Potassium or sodium metabisulfite has been used for thousands of years in making wine. And it's used so frequently that it's got a common name. They're called Campton tablets, and the Campton tablet has about a half a gram of the sodium metabisulfite. Of course, we being chemists, we call it potassium or sodium metabisulfite. In a commercial wine, you might end up with 20 to 40 ppm of sulfite in the final wine. But natural wines, for instance, my wines, we don't add sulfites at all. We use them just sparingly to kill the native yeast, and then again to clean the bottles right before we bottle. The negative about not using sulfites is that the sulfites are added as a preservative and antioxidant. So the natural wines, if you want to call that, you should really drink in 3 to 4 years before they start to lose their flavor and can even turn. Metabisulfite produces free SO2. What this does, as I said, it kills the native yeast, antioxidant. It binds with acetaldehyde and binds with anthocyanins. And the red wine, this can be a problem because the anthocyanins bind with tannins.
Well, the potassium metabisulfite actually contributes to the sulfite content in wine, which tends to concern a lot of wine drinkers. In the U.S. in 1987, they started requiring warning labels on wine that contained or added sulfite compounds. And in 2005, the EU also followed suit, and now that warning label is on wines. But all wines have some amount of sulfite. And reds often get the sulfite blame, but sweet and white wines also have a high amount of sulfite. The natural fermentation process can lead to between 6 and 40 ppm of sulfite. And the U.S. allowable level is actually 350 ppm. So any bottle of wine, whether they add some sulfite commercially or not, is usually going to fall way below that 350 ppm level.
Well, there's a lot of talk about, not a lot of talk, but some people talk about red wine headaches. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen to me. some people can get a headache after drinking 1 glass of red wine. And a lot of people blame it on sulfites. And indeed, there is a certain percentage of the population that are allergic to sulfites. You can get a raging headache from it. But I believe that there's lots of other things in wine that might lead to a headache, not the least of which is drinking too much alcohol. But unmetabolized acetaldehyde can give you a headache. There's also histamines and tannins, serotonins, prostaglandin release. All kind of strains of yeast and bacteria can also react badly with you. I know I stopped drinking beer because the yeast in the beer made me start to sneeze, and my eyes would start to itch and that. I'm allergic to certain kinds of yeast. Well, okay, we've got the grapes now crushed in this big vat that now you can see what it looks like. It's called must at this point. And there's a layer on top, which is this mix of skins and seeds and probably a few leaves in that thrown in there too that didn't get out in the crushing process. The reason you let the skins in there, and in fact mix it around with a red wine, is you want the flavors and the colors to be extracted from the skins in this must. When you punch it down, as it's called, you use these long paddles to just basically mix it around. You get oxygen into the yeast and provides more even fermentation. It prevents bacterial growth, and it lowers the must temperature. It gets too warm, it ferments too fast. And it also increases the production of esters. Seeing recommendations where the red wine should be fermented at a slightly higher temperature than the whites. Now again, as an urban vintner, we don't have temperature control of these things. It's done in this big sort of warehouse building with all the equipment and barrels and everything standing around. And you have to take the temperature you get. So in fact, the red wines, the California grapes tend to ferment in about a week in the fall because they are harvested in New Jersey time. We're talking about August, September, and it's warmer than when we actually harvest the Chilean grapes. They're harvested in South America, obviously, in their fall, which is April. So we do the winemaking for Chilean grapes probably in May sometime, first part of May, and it's simply cooler then, so it takes some 2 weeks to convert the sugar into ethanol. Okay, what's the most important chemical reaction in winemaking? Well, it's conversion of sugar into ethanol and CO2, and that comes from fermentation. So fermentation is sort of a general term. It means when a bacteria or yeast consumes one compound and converts or excretes it as a different compound or product. Again, the most common one that we all think about when we think about fermentation is you take fruit, and the fruit sugars, sucrose, plus yeast makes ethanol, alcohol. And that's what we're looking for and what everybody thinks about. But there's other kind of fermentations as well. For example, if you're making cheese, you take the milk sugars, lactose, with bacteria, and it ends up as cheese. If you're baking bread, well, you couldn't bake, bread wouldn't rise if you didn't have the action of the yeast along with the sugars in the flour to make a raised bread. And of course, you can have bad reactions, fermentations as well. If you take the ethanol and yeast, commonly referred to as mother of vinegar yeast, you end up with acetic acid, which is vinegar. And so that's why you have to be very careful to keep your barrels, once you have the ethanol in there, you have to keep them sealed from oxygen because this mother of vinegar yeast requires oxygen to make it work.
Now, as the fermentation reaction implies, the primary fuel of the whole reaction is the sugar here. And the sugar level in wine is called percent brick. 1% brick is 1% sugar. And ultimately, that will transition into 0.55% of ethanol. So ultimately, your sugar content is going to be your alcohol content. So whatever level of the grapes that you have is going to limit exactly what your alcohol content of your wine will be. Now, sugars are the primary fuel for this fermentation, but not all sugars are fermentable. In wines, there are non-fermentable sugars, the 5-carbon ring sugars like arabinose and xylose, and these are actually still present after fermentation is finished. They're never fermented by the fermentation reaction. So no wine is actually ever completely dry without any sugar. Some vintners, in order to increase the alcohol level in their wines, will actually add sucrose, which is a fermentable sugar, to their wine, and this will actually boost the alcohol content. The normal alcohol content, the highest level that an alcohol content in a wine could be without this sucrose addition, is about 17 or 18%. If we look at the fermentable sugars, the primary fermentable sugar is glucose. It's the very first sugar metabolized by the yeast. So the yeast go after the glucose first, and they will metabolize that fully before moving on and metabolizing some of the other sugars. And glucose is a little less sweet than the next sugar, fructose. And when the grapes are growing and they're starting to ripen, glucose is actually the predominant sugar in the grapes. It's almost 5 times higher than fructose. But at harvest, they're pretty much equal, so there's an equal amount of glucose and fructose. Then you have fructose, which is the second sugar. And as the grapes ripen or over-ripen, it increases the amount of fructose. So it throws the reaction off closer to the fructose level and less of the glucose level. It's twice as sweet as glucose, and this becomes very important for dessert wines, for very sweet wines. It's metabolized after glucose, so the yeast actually metabolize it later in the fermentation process. Now, some vintners, like I said before, will add sugar, and when they do add sugar, they add sucrose. And you'll especially see this in champagnes and sparkling wines where they use the sucrose to help with the carbonation process.
We find this table and it lists typical alcohol percents in different kinds of wines. Now, really, this is just a sort of a guideline because it really depends on the growing conditions for that year, how much rain there was, how hot it was, and just how much sugar is produced by the grapes over the year. We'll get to an equation in a minute, but during fermentation, you strive for greater than 9% alcohol. Very simple reason, because if it gets above 9% alcohol, bacteria can't grow in it. Now, of course, you can have the mother vinegar yeast convert it into vinegar, which is what you don't want, but we generally target the alcohol to be about 13, 14%, which requires about 24-degree Brix to get that percent alcohol. Again, final alcohol really depends on the variety. So once we've crushed the grapes, we've let them sit there for a week or 2 weeks, depending on the temperature and the type of grape and how much sugar there is in there. We test it. We get it down to what I like is less than 1 degree Brix, or less than 1% sugar before putting it into the barrel. We use presses to press the grapes to get about another 15 to 30% out of the grape. You see it here. You just start by pumping the juice out of the big barrel, and again, it's not juice anymore, it's wine at this point. We put as much into the barrel as we can, and then we scoop the residual must back into this wooden slatted device here. It's a wine press, and these slats have a little gap between them so that the wine can filter out between them and get caught in the tray underneath and eventually get pumped into the barrels over here. And we put this wooden platen in there, and then we block it up and press it down with a hydraulic pump. And it's amazing that this big vat of liquid that we saw before, you end up with a cake of seeds and skins that's only about 4 inches thick and about 1.5 to 2 feet in diameter from all those different grapes, cases and cases of grapes you put in. I might point back here just to show you this little device on top of this barrel. That's called a bubbler. And what it does is once you get the wine in here, there's still a little bit of fermentation going on. For instance, we strive for less than 1% sugar in there, but there's still a little bit of fermentation going on in the barrel, so you don't want it to build up pressure. So you have this bubbler, and it's sort of like a reverse siphon. It's got a tube that comes up, makes a U-turn down into a little ball with water in it, so that the CO2 that's generated forces up down the tube, bubbles through the little water reservoir, and comes out the top. However, no oxygen or air can get back in. So, important. The white wines are pressed before you ferment them. You crush the white grapes and you immediately press them. You want to get them, in general, you want to get them off the skins, because the skins, for instance, if you're using a red grape, you want to get them away from the skins so that the wine itself remains white. The red, on the other hand, as I said before, you let them ferment, you punch them down, mix it up, and you get the aromas and the color out of it, and then you press it after fermentation. Pressing actually releases different kind of compounds which are in the layers of the grape skins in that. Also very important, we adjust the pH down to acidic pH of between 3 and 3.7. We use tartaric or malic acid to do that. And again, this is another thing that prevents bacterial growth. These are things that you don't have in beer. Beer has a higher pH, and it also has a lower alcohol content, so that's why you can have bugs grow in beer. Why you have to be very careful about sterilizing everything when you're making beer. The acid also gives it a tart flavor, zing as it's called, on your tongue. And of course, the sweet wines, which still have a greater than 1% sugar in them, you have to stabilize them with potassium sorbate.
If we look at some of the compounds that are in the different levels of or layers of the grape, we're going to just start with some of the seeds and stems and the skin. And these are, for all intents and purposes, optional inclusions by the winemaker because they're not used in every process with every wine. The seeds and stems will have things like tannins in them. The skin will have anthocyanins, quercetin, resveratrol, tannins, and catechins. If we look at the tannins, they're a plant polyphenol, and they bind and precipitate proteins and other compounds. And there are three types of these tannins. There's hydrolyzable tannins, condensed and complex tannins. And the bad tannins are the ones that produce a bitter taste. They don't polymerize, so they're the non-hydrolyzable tannins. And they're usually associated with the skins, the seeds, and the stems. Some of the good tannins, or the beneficial tannins, come from the oak barrels. And these tannins then are preservative, and they're very good at help clarifying the wine. Since they bind so well to proteins, you can add a finding agent or a protein like egg whites or gelatin to the wine when you're trying to clarify the wine. And the tannins will bind to these proteins and help clear your wine or settle your wine out. And young oak barrels actually have more of these tannins, and the more the barrel ages, they start to lose some of the tannins. Now, red wines are very high in tannins. There are a lot of tannins in red wine, and that's one of the reasons it pairs so well with very high-protein meats and high-protein foods, because these good tannins, these hydrolyzable tannins, actually make these complexes with the proteins, and they change the flavor and the mouthfeel of both the wine and the meat. And as tannins age, they start to lose their binding ability. They start to lose some of their bitterness, so the wine is said to mellow. So if you have a red wine over the years that is being stored, the tannins are going to start to fall out of the wine to the bottom of the bottle, and the wine will start to mellow in taste. Then you have the catechins, or the catechins. They're flavonols. They're also found in chocolates. They react with those tannins to make these complexes. So if you have a very large tannin catechin complex, it's a very large molecule. It reacts differently on the palate, so you get more of a mellow flavor. If you have some of the smaller flavonol tannin complexes, something like with one of those bitter tannins, they tend to be a little smaller. You get these smaller complexes, and they react on more of the palate, and you get more of a sharpness or bitterness. And you'll find concentrations of these compounds in red wine from 10 milligrams per liter to 250 milligrams per liter. And the more of them you have, the lighter the body of the wine, the lighter the taste. Then you have the anthocyanins. They're water-soluble pigments in red, purple, and blue. And the color is actually determined by the pH of those anthocyanins. They're flavonoids, and they're also acting as antioxidants, and they're virtually odorless and flavorless. They polymerize with the tannins to make complexes. Now, the important complexes, it helps when they complex with the tannins in order to help age the wine. There are 5 primary groups of anthocyanins, and these depend on the type and varietal of wine and type of varietal of grape. If you have these anthocyanins that have a lot of the free hydroxyl groups, you get a blueness to the wine. If you have anthocyanins groups that have a lot of methyl groups, you'll get a redness to the wine. The most important of the groups for red wines is the Malvin group. It's their very deep red color associated with it. Then you have a few other compounds in the skin and the seed which are important. You have quercetin, which is a flavonoid and an antioxidant. And it's found on the skin of the grape, and it reacts with the anthocyanins to create a nice, deep, vibrant color. Then you have what's considered to be by some health food fanatics or health food proponents to be the new wonder compound, the red wine compound, resveratrol. And it's a phenol compound that's actually produced by plants when they're under attack by bacteria or fungus. So it's found on the outside of the grape. And it works in conjunction with quercetin to be an antioxidant, and it has a lot of reported health benefits. And I just read a short little blurb. They've actually synthesized some of the compounds within this family or group of red wine miracles. Some other skin and seed compounds that you'll find are things like gallic acid, which is an antiviral, antifungal compound. You'll see succinic acid, which is a dicarboxylic acid. It's a flavor component. And interestingly enough, when it's introduced in wine or when it's in wine, you have a kind of a salty, bitter flavor in the wine. But elsewhere, when it's used for other food products, it's actually used as an artificial sweetening agent. And you also have cassic and tartaric acid. They're cinnamotes. They'll give you that yellow gold color in wines. If we look at some of the other zones of the grape, the more interior ones, the ones that basically go whether that's white wine or red wine, you have tartaric acid and sugars. You have potassium, some other acids, some astringents, aroma compounds. And in the center, then you have sugar and malic acid. And acids are very important in the finished product of wine as well as the winemaking process. The component of acidity is important to the flavor profile of a wine. And the primary acids for winemaking and that you actually taste in wine are the malic and the tartaric acid. But there are a host of other acids in varying amounts that either added by the winemaker, or they might be salts from bacterial or yeast contamination, or they just might be small amounts of natural acids found in wine. The primary acid in winemaking is tartaric acid. It maintains the chemical stability of the wine, and it influences the taste and the color. Now, grapevines are one of the very few natural sources of high concentrations of this tartaric acid. So there are a lot of other plants, fruits and vegetables that actually are not a source of tartaric acid. Now, most of us come into tartaric acid in the form of its potassium salt. And all you have to do is open up your spice cabinet at home and find some cream of tartar, because the potassium salt of tartaric acid that we are all very familiar with is this cream of tartar. And during fermentation, this tartaric acid will bind with your pulp and your debris and your tannins and your pigments. Now, sometimes what can happen is that the acid crystals will fall out of the solution of the wine and create something called wine diamonds.
And sometimes you may open a bottle of wine, particularly reds I've seen it in, and you'll see little crystals on the bottom of the cork. Rub your finger over it. Sometimes they're too small to see, but depending on the amount of tartaric acid in the wine, more or less will precipitate that. And all us chemists know that if you have a rough surface, that's what's going to enhance crystallization. So the bottom of the cork is where the crystallization is going to probably occur. They can form there and fall off into the bottom of the bottle so that your last sip of wine is kind of crunchy, particularly like that. But don't worry about it if you see these on the bottom of the cork or in the bottle. It doesn't hurt the wine. It doesn't affect the flavor at all. It doesn't mean it's a bad wine or a good wine necessarily. But those are tartaric acid crystals. And if people, again, professional vintners, if you feel that there's too much tartaric acid in there, you can do a cold stabilization process. Basically what you do, you chill the wine, and as any chemists know, if it gets cold enough, the crystals crystallize out, I should say, and then you filter it, and on you go.
The second most important acid for winemaking is malic acid. It's obviously one of the two primary acids in winemaking. It's a carboxylic diacid, and it's responsible for kind of a bitter, tart taste. And most of us will associate it with a green apple kind of flavor. And if you like a good white Riesling, that has a very high characteristic green apple flavor, and that has high malic acid concentration. Now, the malic acid likes the cooler growing conditions. So grapes that are grown at cooler points of the year or in cooler regions tend to have a higher amount of malic acid. But as the grape ripens, that malic acid will start to decrease. Now, if you have a wine that kind of has a little bit of a flat taste to it or much more of a mellow taste to it, that probably has a low amount of malic acid, whereas a more sharper bite wine will have a high malic acid concentration. Some of the other acids that you find in winemaking is lactic acid. That's added by the winemaker, and it creates kind of a milky flavor. They'll react some lactic acid bacteria and malic acid, and it will give this kind of creamy flavor to the wine, and that's where you get some of the Chardonnay flavors and some of the other white wine kind of creamy flavors to it. The problem with reacting the lactic acid bacteria is it also produces histamines, which can contribute to those quote-unquote red wine headaches. And you'll also find some citric acid in very small quantities. And if you're adding sucrose to make champagne, or you're supplementing the sugar alcohol content with sucrose in the wine, you might find some small amounts of citric acid. Some other acids that you'll find either on purpose or by accident in wine is your acetic acid, which you really don't want above 300 milligrams per liter, because then you'll get that vinegar taste to your wine. There's some vitamin C, which is sometimes added as an antioxidant, and the EU has actually put a limit on how much sorbic acid you can add to wine. And you might have butyric acid. Now, if you have butyric acid, it smells like rancid butter or blue cheese, and this is a bacteria-induced fault. So some bacteria that doesn't belong there has gotten into your wine and reacted to make butyric acid. And then you have sorbic acid, which is also intentionally added to be used as a preservative.
One of the most important areas or points in making wine is the sampling or the tasting of the wine. Now here we're sampling the young wine. Actually, the bucket you see there, you'll never see that in a professional vintner. They have giant stainless steel tanks and pumps and filters and everything. But if you're making wine one barrel at a time, well, when you get down to the bottom of that barrel, or the bottom of the container of the must, you have to scoop the must out of there and put it in the press. And then when you go to press it, you usually end up with a bucket or two left over. And in fact, you saw a previous slide, one of our labels was called Bucket O' Wine. We tend to name our wines each year, and we happen to end up with an extra bucket that year, which we had to drink. But you also want to save a little bit extra, too, and you put them in carboys. We'll get to that in a little bit, why you save a little bit extra wine in the winemaking process. Obviously, you don't want to ever throw any of your wine away. That's alcohol use. Okay, chemistry in a glass, what is it? Well, obviously, it's almost 90% water. It's water except for the ethanol, basically. So if you have 15% alcohol, then you have 85% water with a few other things thrown in, basically flavorings. So you've got some pectins and proteins and various acids that Patty talked about, and some vitamins and minerals. It's all good stuff for you. And then you got some phenols and flavonoids and the other flavor compounds that we're talking about parts per trillion levels for these things.
Now we're going to talk about the aging of the wine, and just an interesting bit of trivia is the average age of a French oak tree used in wine barrels is 170 years old.
Okay, oak barrels. Now, while I'm here, I think you can see right down here a better picture of the bubbler. I just wanted to point that out, and you can see that, well, maybe you can't see. I can see it because I know what it looks like. It comes up and makes a U-turn, comes down to a little ball with water in it, and then the bubble comes up and lets the excess CO2 out. Well, okay, we store our wine in oak barrels. Now, if you're making white wines, a lot of people do the fermentation and the storage in stainless steel tanks or barrels about the same size. Some people don't like an oaky flavor in a Chardonnay. A lot of people like an oaky Chardonnay. I personally don't like oak-flavored white wines. I don't really like white wines to begin with, but that's another story for another webinar. There's two different kinds of major oak trees that are used, French oak and American oak. The French oaks are traditionally aged and then split. Americans, of course, like to do everything in a hurry, so we take the American oak, we kiln dry it, and we saw it. What the American oak, when you saw it, it ruptures the xylem cells in the wood, and it releases lactones, and various lactones are really a vanilla flavor. So you get a larger oak flavor in the American oak barrels than you do in the French oak barrels. I actually use French oak barrels, and they're whiskey barrels, or used whiskey barrels. The reason I use them primarily is because of cost. If you buy a new barrel, it can run you a lot of money, but if you buy a used whiskey barrel, it's about 1/3 the price. And you don't get a whiskey flavor hangover from it. It's cleaned out real good and tastes just like any other barrel. I would also say that the oak flavor is only good from the barrel for the first 3 or 4 groups of wine that are in here. Now, to just show you here, this happens to be the Surrey, another person that made this. They did a mixture here of Carmenet and a Cabernet, and I don't know what CH stands for, but it's 3 different wines in that one there.
If we just want to look a little bit about those oak barrels, they only started really coming into use during the Roman Empire. Before that, you had amphoras and other types of vessels for storing and aging wine. And in the world, there's about 400 species of oak, but only 20 of them are used for wine barrel making. And if you're ever curious of how many wine barrels you can actually get out of an oak tree, you can get 2 barrels out of 1 tree. When they harvest the wood from these oak trees, they actually only use 5% of the wood. So they're very picky about what wood will be used for these oak barrels. And the oak barrels are a source for tannins. So a new barrel has a high amount of tannins, an older barrel less tannins. But if you have a green oak or an oak that has not properly aged in the ground before it was harvested for a barrel, you'll get a higher concentration of those bad or those non-hydrolyzable tannins. The oak barrels are good for winemaking because there's a porousness to it. It allows for some oxidation and evaporation of the wine. It allows a little bit of breathing in the wine. And you'll actually lose between 5 and 6 gallons on the standard 60-gallon barrel.
I'd actually make a comment here, a little bit of wine trivia. We have, last point is called the angel share. Well, when you think about it, wood is porous, and when you store the wine in there, a little bit of the wine actually seeps through the wood and evaporates. And you lose, 5 or 6 gallons over the period of a year while it's stored in the oak barrel. You generally check them every 2 months, something like that, and top them off. Again, I said that you save that extra wine in a carboy. The reason you save it is because you use to top off the angel share, because you don't want a lot of headspace in that barrel while it's aging.
And as Ralph had mentioned before, you usually get 3 or 4 vintages out of an oak barrel before you start to lose the character, the oak character of the barrel. And winemakers, in order to save some costs or not have to buy a brand new expensive oak barrel, they have a few tricks in order to try to extend the life of their barrel. They'll actually sand the inside of the barrel to open up the oak and expose that fresh oak surface to the wine. Or they'll sometimes add oak strips inside the barrel to kind of import a fresh oak flavor to the wine. Some other influences about the barrel on the taste and flavor of the wine is they'll toast the barrel. They'll expose the oak barrel to heat or fire, and these will produce different compounds. It reduces some of the lactones of fresh oak, but it will also increase the vanilla and caramel aromas like the vanillin. If you have a really high toast level, you'll get a lot more spicy or smoky notes to a barrel. And sometimes vintners will actually add oak chips, as you can see on the picture on the right here. They'll add some oak chips to impart this kind of smoky or caramel flavor even more to their wines.
That previous slide looked like one of those oaky Chardonnays they were preparing. Okay, the next step in making it, okay, we've crushed it, we've let the primary fermentation come, we've pressed it, we've pumped it into the barrel, and then you let it sit. We generally let it sit for up to about 4 to 5 months, and then you need to rack it. Now, this term barking at the moon was a term used for racking the wine, and again, people have been doing this for thousands of years, and there was a belief that you got better wine if you racked the wine under the clear light of a full moon. I always thought it was a dog barking at a full moon or some drunk running around under the full moon, but this is where it came from. Racking is very simple. You pump out the wine from the solids that have settled into the bottom of the barrel, sort of a slimy lees, as it's called, and it's basically the dead yeast and whatever pieces of skin were floating around in there. You clean it out really good, and you pump the wine back in and top it off. And of course, when you're racking the wine, this usually takes place in January here in the East Coast. You have to sample it very carefully and taste it, make sure it's doing all right. And of course, there's a group of specs that are doing just that. And this is Laura. She's one of our chief samplers, as you can see, having a good time. And it looks like the wine tasted pretty good at that point. I don't think that was Coca-Cola. Okay, now we've got to 11 months after the actual crushing of the grape. Some people leave the grapes in the wine, in the barrel for 2 years. Or maybe even longer. That's called a reserve. And of course, you have to keep topping it off every so often and cleaning it out. But we're too impatient. We want to drink it. So after about 11 months, we do the bottling process. And you can see Debbie over here. She's having a real good time. She's working on the bottle. The first thing we do is we clean the bottles. We use a dilute solution of potassium metabisulfite. It cleans the inside of the bottle and also kills any bacteria or fungus that might be hanging around inside the bottle. Right here, this is a little pump that squirts it up inside, and then you put these on a rack to let them drip completely out dry. We transfer the wine from the barrel into, you can just see the bottom of the hopper here. It's a stainless steel hopper in the bottling machine. Everything's done manually, but this machine has a gravity feed through these tubes into these filling spouts. And the filling spout, you push the bottle up on the filling spout, and it sets in place at a certain height. And when the O-ring seal is lifted, when you push this up, it permits wine to flow into the bottle. However, there's a siphon hole right about at this point here, right about where the bottle starts to neck. And once the wine gets up to that level, it stops filling the bottle. The reason you want that fairly carefully controlled is because you're going to jam a cork in here. And this headspace, as you call it, when it gets jammed on, it compresses the headspace down to about half the volume, so you have 2 atmospheres of pressure in here after you do the corking, which is over here. We hand cork everything. This little manual machine holds the bottle here, and there are, I believe, 4 steel jaws in this thing here that come together as you pull the hammer down. And you put a cork in here, and as you push this lever hammer down, it squeezes the cork so it's small enough to fit in the bottle, and then a plunger rams it down into the bottle, into the neck. The last thing you have to do is you don't have to, but we put the capsules on them. These are shrink seal plastic capsules with a tear-off top on them. Slide it on the bottle, and then you shrink seal it using this little device here.
Now I wanted to talk a little bit about the bottles. The shape of the bottle, when wine was first bottled, you had squat, flat-bottom bottles. That's because there weren't corks invented at that time, so they would use oil-soaked rags. So you would have basically a vertical bottle, squat on the bottom, flat bottom, because you wouldn't want to lay the bottles on the side with a cork stuffed into the neck. As corks were developed and used around the late 17th century, you started to be able to store bottles on their sides. So they started to become long and cylindrical so they could be laid on their sides. Nowadays, though, the shape of the bottle can be traditional, cultural, just plain marketing. Some brands, some wineries like to have a characteristic shape to their bottles to kind of identify themselves as a brand. And I found this table here, and I just thought it was very interesting, all the different ranges of sizes of wine bottles that you can get, from a quarter of a standard bottle, which is called a piccolo, which is about 0.1875 liters, all the way up to something which, the biggest bottle I've ever personally seen, it was a Nebuchadnezzar, which was 15 liters, or 20 standard bottles. But supposedly there is a bottle, which I don't even remember the pronunciation of, Melchizedek. I'm sorry if I butchered that. I know we had the pronunciation before, but it's kind of hard to remember that one, to be honest.
You can't lift the bottle anyhow, it doesn't matter.
It's 30 liters or 40 standard bottles. So that would be a hell of a party with that particular bottle.
Okay, corks. The primary sealer for bottles for thousands of years, a couple thousand years, has been the oak, which comes from the bark of the cork oak. And the trees have to be about 25 years old before you can actually strip the cork from the bark. If you think about it, if you look at these corks, they're about 2 to 2.5 inches long. And this is the thickness of the bark stripped off the cork oak. So the tree takes about, 10 years to develop this thickness on it after you strip it once. But the trees will live for 200 years. So you can get a lot of, basically, well, if you subtract 25 from that, you end up with about, 18 different sets of stripped bark off there that you can make corks from. And they make a lot of corks. Portugal, Spain, and Italy basically attribute for all the corks that are produced, mostly Portugal and Spain. Everybody's probably heard the term, this wine is corked wine or corked taint. The cork industry claims that only about 1% of corked wine is actually cork tainted. I might say maybe even less. I rarely, quite frankly, get a bad bottle of wine from what I consider from the cork. It might be fizzy or nasty on your tongue or something like that, but the cork flavor is believed to come from what they call as trichloroanisole, which is a methylated trichlorophenol. It's methylated by fungi, which they believe is in the cork. It's a damp, moldy odor, but I really prefer to think of it as the smell and the taste you get from Listerine. So you can imagine having a Listerine taste to your wine. It really can't drink it. The human detection limit of TCA is about 1 part per trillion. I might also mention that for all these flavors and wines, it's down around 1 part per trillion. So it's very difficult to actually identify what some of these flavors are coming from, what compounds. You can, of course, eliminate cork taint with either screw corks or screw caps, or synthetic corks. The one thing that you don't have with a screw cap or synthetic cork, and there's nothing wrong with them. I've seen better and better wines being used with screw caps these days, but it doesn't have the pop that you do from a real cork, which I would miss.
And since SPEX CertiPrep is a certified reference materials company, and the president of our company is our urban vintner here, we of course have a whole suite of wine testing standards, including the cork taint standards and some of the acids. We have some multi-component standards as well as some single-component standards. I want to talk a little bit about storage, and here's just kind of interesting trivia. One of the oldest intact wine cellars actually sits at 12,000 to 13,000 feet below sea level on the ocean floor, and it's the Titanic. When they found the Titanic in the late 80s and started exploring it in the 90s, they were able to find that the wine cellar was actually intact, and a lot of the wine bottles were still intact in that wine cellar. The interesting fact, though, is that most modern wines are consumed within 24 hours after being purchased. This is near-term consumption. So there aren't a lot of wines that are being saved for long-term storage. But if you are a connoisseur and you do save some wines, some of the things you might want to really consider are there are 3 real important factors about storage of wine. Light, because the light will react with phenolic compounds and change the character and aroma and flavor of a wine. You also have temperature. So if your temperature is between 10 and 15 degrees C, that's kind of ideal for wine storage, because every 8 degrees Celsius that the temperature increases, it doubles the rate of reaction in the wine. So it will age your wine more quickly. It will start to degrade the wine. And finally, you hear about humidity in a wine cellar or in a wine locker. This is mostly primarily to keep the corks from drying out, so you don't get any air into your wine and you don't get any leakage or deterioration of the cork. And of course, there's for hundreds of years there have been wine cellars and wine refrigerators, and their primary purpose is to keep this constant light temperature and humidity.
Well, I put this slide in there just to prove to anybody that I'm not afraid to touch a glass of white wine. Seriously, this one is to enjoy your wine, and a lot of people talk about breathing the wine or letting your wine breathe after you open it. What this is believed to do is if you have a stinky red, there might be a little bit of hydrogen sulfide in there that you want to get rid of. And letting the wine breathe, of course, the hydrogen sulfide can come off. But if you're just going to pop the cork and let the wine sit on the table, as a chemist, you know that there's not enough surface area there to really do anything about getting any gases out of the wine. If you use a decanter, they generally have a narrow top and a big fat bottom, so that when you pour the wine in there, you have 100 times larger surface area, and that'll help a lot. But today they have very nice aerators that have a little venturi in the side of them, and you can just pour the bottle right through it, aerate it instantly. And in fact, I have a couple that fit in as a cork in the bottle, and so as you pour each glass, it aerates it right out.
Now, if you ever really needed a reason to be drinking wine, Food and Wine magazine published in 2007 their 8 benefits of drinking wine. So they give you all these 8 reasons of why drinking wine has health benefits, from reducing heart attack, promoting longevity, lowering heart disease, reducing type 2 diabetes, lowering stroke. It cuts risk of cataracts, colon cancer, and last but not least, it slows your brain decline. So if you drink wine, supposedly you're reducing your risk of brain disease, and maybe you'll be drinking wine way into old age.
I sure hope so. We're going to find out. I'm testing that hypothesis every day. Now, this is a non-scientific study that I saw. Well, I should say it's a scientific study, but I haven't seen it really affirmed anywhere. But the study talked about alcohol not being really metabolized properly in the human body. And when you think about that, the police test for the alcohol that's actually coming out of your breath, and you certainly excrete the alcohol. So maybe the alcohol isn't metabolized. And what I've done is I've developed a little equation that enables you to calculate the calories in an alcoholic beverage by subtracting out the calories that might be due to the alcohol in it. The N is the net calories, and T is the total start number of calories. And of course, the chemist, this is kilocalories, of course. But if you know the percent alcohol and number of ounces you're drinking, you can calculate easily the number of calories, calories per gram of alcohol there in the equation, and subtract it out. And so a typical glass of wine might have 115 calories in it, but if you subtract out the alcohol calories, you're left with about 10 calories in that glass. A light beer is about the same. Regular beer, you have about 20 calories. Still not a lot. But if you get into a sweet drink like a margarita, something like that, or one of these sweetened, all those, the olive. Martinis, yes, good thing. I don't drink that kind of stuff, so I don't even know the names. But or a double block or something like that, you can have hundreds of calories in your drink.
If we're going to talk about some of the negative side effects of alcohol, we really should look at some of the possible contaminations that are present in wine. And the first one that comes to mind are pesticides in wine. In the U.S., there's a list published every year called the Dirty Dozen of produce. These are fruits and vegetables which are found to have the highest concentrations of pesticides. And grapes invariably, year after year, hits that list of the Dirty Dozen. So if your grapes actually have high levels of pesticides, well then there is definitely the possibility you're going to have some pesticides in your wine residue, pesticide residues in your wine. Now, in 2008, the Pesticide Action Network in Europe tested 40 bottles of European-made wine, and they found 128 pesticide residues in the range from the low ppb to the low ppm range. And they're now conducting studies to find out if these pesticide levels are actually of concern in wine. Here at SPEX, we actually have two products that kind of address some of the pesticide and wine issues. We have our SPEX CertiPrep pesticide standards. This happens to be a list from the Pesticide Action Network of the most commonly found pesticides in wine. But we also have, with our sister companies, SPEX Sample Prep, we have our Geno Grinder, which a lot of laboratories and vintners and other agricultural groups use to process their grape samples in order to test for things like wine and DNA and other things.
The Geno Grinder is actually used for lots of different purposes. You know, if you want to look for pesticides in anything from a tomato to a head of lettuce, you can't just stuff the tomato into the instrument and tell. You have to extract the pesticides from it. So what we're saying here for wine or grapes is true for any vegetable.
Another possible contamination is heavy metals in wine. And there was a study from the United Kingdom, I think, or Europe, please don't quote me exactly where it came from, that found that there are hazardous levels of certain metals in wine. And they developed a calculation of these metals, and they found that they exceed the EPA's target hazard quotients for vanadium, copper, manganese, zinc, chromium, nickel, and lead. And the worst countries for these metals were Hungary, Slovakia, Spain, Austria, Germany, Portugal, and Greece. And of course, here at SPEX CertiPrep, we carry a full line of all of these metals as mixes or a single standard for all types of instrumentation, from our AA all the way to IC, ICP-MS. And we also can create any custom standards that our customers need for heavy metal analysis.
All right, so thanks again, from Patty. Excellent job. We've got time for a little bit of time. Actually, we're just about it. But if anybody has any questions, just type them in the question box. We're certainly more than willing to hang around and answer them. We've got one or two up now, but I'll give you a few more minutes to type it in. I'll just cover a couple other things that I'd like to go over. Earlier this year, SPEX CertiPrep unveiled our 2011 and 2012 edition of our Certified Reference Materials catalog. So you can now request a hard copy edition, electronic version on CD, or view an interactive version right on our website. We're also pleased to announce the latest addition to our consumer safety product line, standard for USP 232 for analyzing elemental impurities in pharmaceuticals. You can visit our website, spexcertiprep.com, for more information. And another promotion that we're running, in honor of 2011 being the International Year of Chemistry, SPEX CertiPrep is proud to help support the American Chemical Society's Pennies for Pure Water effort. The ACS is raising funds to purchase water purification packets for distribution to areas where clean and potable water is not readily available. SPEX CertiPrep is offering a 10% discount on all our stock products. If you use promotion code PURE11-10 during checkout, not only will you save money, we will also donate an equivalent amount of your savings to this great cause. And as always, we encourage everyone to connect with us on favorite social networking site. We have pages on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and so on. Just follow us on Twitter, and you can stay up to date about our future webinars, promotions, and other news. So it looks like we've got quite a few questions here. So let's start. At what point in the fermentation process would you add a clarifier like egg white?
I believe that's done as you when you've pressed it, or at the racking point. You mix the egg whites or another clarifier with it, let it sit for a while, and then basically run it through a filter.
Let's see. A couple of people asking for copies of the slides. We're going to send an email out after the webinar ends. You're going to receive an email with a link to the slides you can download. And also, in about a week or so, a recording of the webinar will be out. Okay, next question: how can I go about receiving literature on wines or trace metal standards? We'll include links to those files as well. Do you give tours, tastings of the winery?
Actually, that's the place I use is called Grape Expectations. It's in Bridgewater, New Jersey. And these, I don't do it in my cellar. That's the bottom line. Because this guy has a temperature-controlled warehouse. He's got all the equipment, as you've seen. And he's actually a vintner, and he checks the sugar content and the acid content for you and helps you along. I've never hit a bad barrel, bottom line. People stop by, and everybody's invited. If you know someone else that's making it, you can certainly come along and help with making it. But he actually has, in January during the racking process, and then during the summer when he's finishing up the bottling of the California wines, he has usually Saturday and Sunday weekends where he has, it's a marketing effort for him, where he has an open house. And it's more or less like a tasting. And you taste the various wines that he's made. He saves 3 bottles out of every barrel that people make and uses them for his tasting. So yes, you can do that. Again, I think it's justmygrapes.com if you're in the Jersey area.
There are other places around the country. It's become actually a cottage industry for urban vintner warehouses to appear in different states that don't necessarily have natural wine grape growing agricultural. So you could always type in urban vintner into your favorite search engine, and you might find in your local area an entrepreneur who's doing their own urban vintner operation. And a lot of them are more than willing to have an open house so you can taste the different varietals and get a kind of hands-on experience of what it looks like.
All right. How many different types of fermenting yeast are there?
The answer to that, well, there are thousands of different yeasts, natural yeasts. But in the wine books I've seen, there's hundreds of different vintage yeasts you can get. Personally, I'm not an expert in that. I let the Grape Expectation people choose the yeast for me, and I'm sure there's different yeast for white wines versus heavy reds versus Pinot Noirs, but there are hundreds, I guess, of these.
Okay. What type of flavors do the whiskey barrels give to the wine?
I've never tasted any leftover whiskey taste from, it's basically an oak barrel, and they clean them out real good, so it just gives an oaky flavor.
Let's see. How much wine are you making each year?
I generally make, again, with my friends or with my staff members, I generally do 4 barrels, 4 60-gallon barrels. Each barrel is 24 cases or 288 bottles. You can do the math. But, you know, if you have 8 people in the barrel, you walk away with 1/8 of 288 bottles. And other things you can do, too. For instance, I made a half a barrel this year. One of my sons is getting married. So I took half a barrel. Again, that's 144 bottles, but I made splits. A split is the half bottles, and I'm making them for his wedding with a custom label on them. So there's all kind of things you can get involved with.
Where to buy the grape juice? Where can I buy the grape juice for winemaking?
There are a lot of stores. You can actually buy it online. Just Google it. You can buy winemaking kits. You can buy the juice, or you can even go down to your produce yard and buy the grapes if you're going to do it yourself. But don't forget, you have to test it for sugar. You have to test it for pH. If you're buying grapes, well, I guess that's juice, right? So you wouldn't have to crush them in that. But you'd also have to have a storage container for them.
Okay. How do you clean the barrels?
The barrels are cleaned with just a heavy jet of heavy jet of water. Basically, if you pump the wine out of it, if you're going to put it in storage, you invert the barrel upside down with a bunghole on the bottom. You still lay the barrel on its side. And they have this kind of interesting device. It's a pipe. You attach a water hose to it, and on the top of the pipe, it has a flat piece of metal on it so that it makes a spray almost like a high-powered sprinkler for your yard. And you stick that up inside the barrel, and it shoots this high-pressure jet of water inside the barrel and flushes everything out. When you store the barrel, you have to fill it with water, unless you're going to put your wine back in it. You store it with water filled in it because you have to keep the staves moist. If the staves of wood dry out, just like in a boat, it'll leak.
And I have one more question here. You usually make wine in 6-gallon glass bottles. How much egg white would I use to clarify this volume of liquid?
No idea. I've never actually used a clarifier on my wine. It comes out sparkling clear every time. Don't ask me why, but we do run it through a filter when we're pumping it into the barrel.
Okay. Looks like that's all the questions. So again, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. As a special thank you gift, we're going to be sending everyone a SPEX CertiPrep wine corkscrew. Thank you again, and see you again in a future webinar.